April rain had turned London streets into rivers of mud when the distinguished surgeon, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, burst into our Baker Street rooms in a state of complete professional and personal crisis, clutching a medical file that would lead us into one of the most medically impossible cases Sherlock Holmes would ever investigate. Holmes, who had been studying various methods of detecting blood traces on fabric, research that would prove eerily relevant to our investigation, looked up immediately upon seeing the renowned surgeon's ashen face and trembling hands. Dr. Whitfield was a man of perhaps 50 years, with the steady hands and calm demeanour expected of Britain's finest surgical practitioners, but that composure had clearly been shattered by whatever medical impossibility had driven him to seek our assistance. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began without preamble, his voice carrying the strain of sleepless nights. "3 weeks ago, I performed surgery on a patient who should not exist. I removed a bullet from his chest, a bullet that, according to every principle of anatomy and ballistics, should have killed him instantly. Yet he survived the wound, survived my surgery, and walked out of my hospital. Yesterday, that same patient returned with an identical wound in the exact same location, requiring me to remove another bullet from precisely where I'd operated 3 weeks earlier. This is medically impossible. The scarring, the healing timeline, the location, everything about this second wound defies explanation. Before I continue with this most perplexing case, please subscribe to Detective Sherlock if you haven't already. Your support helps us bring these mysteries to life. Like this video, hit the notification bell, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let us proceed with the extraordinary mystery of the surgeon's impossible patient. Holmes set down his chemical apparatus immediately, his grey eyes sharpening with that intense focus he brought to genuinely puzzling problems. "Dr. Whitfield, you're quite certain it's the same patient? Not a case of mistaken identity or similar-looking individuals?" "Absolutely certain," Whitfield replied, opening his medical file with shaking hands. "The patient's name is Thomas Kearney, age 32, dock worker from Limehouse. I have detailed surgical notes from both operations, photographs of the wounds, even tissue samples. The scarring from my first surgery was clearly visible when I operated the second time. There's no possibility of error. I operated on the same man, in the same location, for the same type of injury, just 3 weeks apart." "Describe the wounds in detail," I said, my medical training immediately engaged by this impossible scenario. "The first wound occurred 3 weeks ago. Kearney was brought to St. Bartholomew's Hospital with a gunshot wound to the left chest, approximately 2 inches below the clavicle and 1 inch left of the sternum. Bullet had penetrated between the ribs, narrowly missing the heart and major vessels. Lucky trajectory that should have been fatal, but wasn't. I successfully removed the bullet, repaired damaged tissue, and the patient recovered remarkably quickly. He was discharged after 10 days. "And the second wound?" Holmes prompted. "Yesterday, Kearney returned with what appeared to be an identical gunshot wound. Same location, same trajectory, same type of bullet. But here's what makes it impossible. When I opened the surgical site, I could clearly see my previous work. The scarring from my first operation was present, partially healed but unmistakable. Yet somehow, a new bullet had been lodged in exactly the same location. as if the first injury had never occurred, or as if Kearney had been shot again in precisely the same spot. Could he have been shot again? I asked. Perhaps someone targeted him deliberately, aiming for the previous wound site. That was my initial thought, Whitfield admitted. But the probability of a second bullet entering at exactly the same angle, penetrating between exactly the same ribs, and lodging in precisely the same tissue depth, it's astronomically unlikely. No shooter could achieve such precision, especially on a moving target. And there's more. His voice dropped. The bullet I removed yesterday was identical to the one I removed 3 weeks ago. Same caliber, same manufacturer's marks, same degree of deformation from impact. I compared them under microscope. They're not just similar. They appear to be the exact same bullet. Holmes rose from his chair and began pacing, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. The same bullet removed twice from the same patient. That is indeed impossible through any conventional medical or physical process. Dr. Whitfield, I must examine both bullets, review your surgical notes, and interview this Thomas Kearney personally. There's deception here, either in how these wounds occurred, in the identity of the patient, or in some aspect of the medical process itself. I've brought the bullets, the surgical notes, and photographs, Whitfield said, laying materials on Holmes's desk. But Kearney has disappeared. After I performed the second surgery yesterday, he left the hospital against medical advice. I've tried to locate him at the address he provided, but it appears to be false. He's vanished completely. Holmes examined the two bullets minutely under his magnifying lens, comparing them in detail. Both were .45 caliber, showing similar deformation patterns, identical manufacturer markings. To all appearances, they were indeed the same bullet. An impossibility that suggested either remarkable fraud or some physical phenomenon beyond current scientific understanding. Dr. Whitfield, who brought Kearney to hospital on both occasions? Holmes asked. The first time, dock workers from Limehouse, who said he'd been shot during a robbery attempt. The second time, he arrived alone by cab, already bleeding, saying he'd been attacked again. Both times he was conscious, able to speak, despite injuries that should have incapacitated him. Did he explain how he came to be shot in both instances? He claimed the first shooting was a robbery. The second time, he said someone was trying to kill him, that they'd shot him again deliberately. He seemed genuinely frightened, said he needed my help to survive, that only I could save him because I'd done it before. Holmes's eyes narrowed. He specifically requested you as surgeon both times? Yes. The first time, he was brought to St. Bartholomew's where I was on duty, so it seemed coincidental. But the second time, he came directly to the hospital during my shift, asking for me by name. He said I was the only surgeon who could help him, that he trusted me because I'd saved him before. This is no coincidence, Holmes said decisively. Thomas Kearney targeted you specifically, Dr. Whitfield. Both surgeries were arranged deliberately, for purposes we must determine. The question is, how did he create the illusion of two identical gunshot wounds 3 weeks apart? And why would anyone subject themselves to major surgery twice for such deception? Holmes spent the remainder of that day conducting intensive investigation into Thomas Carney's background. He sent inquiries to dock authorities in Limehouse, searched police records for information about the alleged robbery and second shooting, and attempted to trace Carney's actual identity and whereabouts. The results were disturbing. Thomas Carney, as described by Dr. Whitfield, appeared to exist only in medical records from St. Bartholomew's Hospital. The address he'd provided was a vacant warehouse. The dock workers who'd supposedly brought him to hospital the first time could not be located. No police reports existed for either shooting incident. It was as if Carney had materialized solely for the purpose of these two surgeries, then vanished back into non-existence. We're dealing with an elaborate fraud, Holmes concluded. But what kind of fraud requires being shot twice and undergoing major surgery twice? What could anyone possibly gain that would justify such extreme methods? The answer came from an unexpected source. Holmes's network of informants throughout London's criminal underworld brought word that several insurance companies were investigating suspicious claims related to workplace injuries at London docks. Workers were claiming injuries and collecting compensation, but the injuries were inconsistent with the alleged accidents, and several claimants had disappeared after receiving payment. Insurance fraud, Holmes said when he learned of these investigations. But this is an extraordinarily sophisticated variant. Carney isn't simply faking injuries. He's actually sustaining them, undergoing real surgery, creating genuine medical documentation that would withstand scrutiny. Then he uses that documentation to claim compensation from multiple insurance policies. But why shoot himself twice? I objected. Once would be sufficient for an insurance claim. The second surgery seems excessive and dangerous. Unless he's claiming compensation from multiple insurers, Holmes replied. Each surgery generates complete medical records from a respected hospital and a distinguished surgeon. Those records could be used to support claims with different insurance companies, each believing they're paying for a unique injury. If Kearney has policies with, say, 10 different insurers, he could submit the same medical documentation to each, collecting payment 10 times for a single injury. But we have 2 injuries, I pointed out, 2 surgeries 3 weeks apart. Which doubles his potential claims, Holmes said. 20 insurance payouts instead of 10. And by having them occur close together, he ensures the medical documentation is recent and harder to verify across different insurers before he's collected and disappeared with the proceeds. Holmes immediately contacted Scotland Yard and various insurance companies to pursue this theory. What emerged confirmed his suspicions. Thomas Kearney, under various names and identities, had filed injury claims with at least 15 different insurance companies over the past month. Each claim included medical documentation from St. Bartholomew's Hospital, signed by Dr. Marcus Whitfield, describing gunshot wounds treated surgically. The claims totaled over £20,000, an enormous sum obtained through self-inflicted injury and medical fraud. But the impossible aspect remains, Whitfield protested when Holmes explained the fraud scheme. How did Kearney arrange to be shot twice in exactly the same location? How could he control the bullet trajectory, the penetration depth, the precise anatomical positioning? Even if he's deliberately injuring himself for fraud, the medical impossibility of duplicating the wounds so exactly is unexplainable. That's because the second wound wasn't a new gunshot injury, Holmes said. It was a surgical recreation of the first wound, made to appear like a fresh gunshot, but actually created through deliberate incision and insertion of the original bullet back into the surgical site. The room fell silent as the implications of Holmes's statement became clear. "You're saying Kearney cut himself open?" I asked, horrified. "Deliberately created a surgical wound that mimicked gunshot trauma?" "Not Kearney himself. He lacks medical knowledge and surgical skill," Holmes replied. "But someone working with him, someone with detailed understanding of anatomy and wound characteristics, created a false gunshot wound that would require surgical treatment. That person reopened Kearney's partially healed surgical site, created trauma resembling bullet impact, and inserted the original bullet back into approximately the same location it had occupied during the first injury." "That's grotesque," Whitfield said, his face pale. "But it would explain the impossibility. If someone with surgical knowledge deliberately created a wound mimicking the first injury, placing the same bullet back into the surgical site, it would appear to me like a second gunshot, when in fact it was carefully staged trauma." "Precisely," Holmes agreed. "And this suggests Kearney has an accomplice, someone with medical training, access to surgical instruments, and willingness to participate in this fraud by creating the false second wound. Dr. Whitfield, who else at St. Bartholomew's would have had access to your surgical notes, photographs, and details about Kearney's first injury?" Whitfield considered carefully. "Any surgeon or physician at the hospital could access patient records, but to recreate the wound with the precision you're describing would require someone who'd actually examined Kearney directly, who understood the exact anatomical details of the first injury." "Who assisted you during the first surgery?" Holmes asked sharply. "My usual surgical team, Dr. Lawrence Pemberton as assistant surgeon, Nurse Sarah Matthews, the anaesthetist, Dr. James Thornton. All experienced, all trusted colleagues I've worked with for years." "One of them is Kearney's accomplice," Holmes stated with certainty. "One of your trusted colleagues participated in this fraud by using their medical knowledge and access to create the false second wound." Holmes's investigation focused intensively on Dr. Whitfield's surgical team. He examined their financial records, looking for evidence of sudden wealth or debt that might motivate participation in fraud. He investigated their backgrounds, their associations, their possible connections to Thomas Kearney or criminal networks. The breakthrough came from examining Dr. Lawrence Pemberton's recent activities. Pemberton, the assistant surgeon who had helped Whitfield operate on Kearney both times, had been meeting regularly with known insurance fraud investigators, but not as a witness helping their investigation. He was being investigated himself for suspicious involvement in multiple injury claims from dock workers. "Pemberton is running an insurance fraud operation," Holmes explained after days of intensive investigation. "He identifies workers willing to sustain genuine injuries in exchange for a share of insurance payouts. He provides medical treatment to ensure the injuries are properly documented, then helps file claims with multiple insurers using the same injury documentation. Kearney was one of his recruited participants." "But why involve me?" Whitfield demanded. Why have me perform the surgeries when Pemberton could do it himself? Because your reputation provides credibility, Holmes replied. You're Britain's most distinguished chest surgeon. Medical documentation signed by Marcus Whitfield carries enormous weight with insurers. Claims supported by your surgical notes are virtually unquestioned. Pemberton needed your unknowing participation to make the fraud believable. Holmes arranged for Pemberton to be arrested, but the assistant surgeon had fled upon learning that Holmes was investigating. A manhunt ensued, with police searching for both Pemberton and Kearney throughout London. The capture came after Holmes deduced where Pemberton would hide. Using his knowledge of London's criminal geography and Pemberton's medical background, Holmes reasoned the surgeon would seek refuge in Limehouse, among the dock workers he'd been using for his fraud scheme. Police raided a boarding house in Limehouse and found both Pemberton and Kearney hiding together. Kearney's chest showed signs of recent surgical incision, evidence of the deliberately created false wound that had mimicked a second gunshot injury. Under interrogation, both men confessed to the fraud scheme. Pemberton admitted recruiting dock workers for his operation, offering them substantial payments in exchange for sustaining controllable injuries that could be treated surgically and documented for insurance claims. I would identify injuries that looked serious but were actually survivable with proper treatment, Pemberton explained with disturbing clinical detachment. Gunshots that missed vital organs, knife wounds in non-critical locations, fractures that healed cleanly. I'd arrange for these injuries to occur, sometimes accidentally through their dangerous work, sometimes deliberately inflicted under controlled conditions, then ensure they received treatment that created excellent medical documentation. And Kearney agreed to be shot deliberately, I asked, appalled. For £5,000, he agreed to almost anything, Pemberton said. The first gunshot was real. I arranged for an associate to shoot him at the docks, carefully aimed to miss vital structures. I knew Dr. Whitfield was on duty and would perform the surgery excellently, creating perfect documentation. Then I used that documentation to file claims with multiple insurers on Kearney's behalf. And 3 weeks later, you created the false second wound, Holmes said. Yes, I reopened the partially healed surgical site, created tissue trauma that resembled gunshot impact, and inserted the original bullet back into approximately the same position. It required considerable surgical skill, but I'd studied Whitfield's notes carefully. I knew exactly how to make it appear like a second gunshot. When Kearney returned to the hospital, Whitfield treated it as a genuine new injury, performed surgery, and created another complete set of medical records, doubling the documentation I could use for insurance claims. You exploited Dr. Whitfield's skill and reputation, Holmes said coldly. You put a man's life at risk twice, subjected him to unnecessary surgery, and corrupted medical practice for profit. The trial of Dr. Lawrence Pemberton and his accomplices was one of the most sensational medical fraud cases in Victorian legal history. Evidence showed the scheme had been operating for over a year, involving dozens of dock workers who'd sustained genuine injuries, then had their medical documentation used to file fraudulent insurance claims. The total fraud exceeded £100,000, an enormous criminal enterprise built on the deliberate injury of vulnerable workers. Pemberton was convicted on multiple charges, including fraud, assault, and professional misconduct. He was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment and permanently barred from medical practice. Kearney and other participants received lesser sentences, but still faced years in prison for their roles in the scheme. For Dr. Whitfield, the case brought both vindication and profound distress. "I performed surgery twice on the same patient, never suspecting the second injury was deliberately created fraud," he told Holmes after the trial concluded. "My reputation, my medical judgment, my surgical skill, all were exploited by someone I'd trusted as a colleague." "You're a victim in this case, not a perpetrator," Holmes assured him. "Pemberton deliberately deceived you, used your expertise unknowingly to further his fraud. No reasonable surgeon would have suspected that a patient's second gunshot wound was actually surgical recreation of the first injury." The case of the surgeon's impossible patient entered my notes as one of Holmes's most medically complex investigations. It demonstrated that medical impossibilities, in this case identical wounds occurring 3 weeks apart, often indicate deliberate fraud rather than supernatural or physically impossible phenomena. It showed how medical expertise could be corrupted for criminal purposes, with skilled surgeons creating injuries that appeared genuine but were actually staged. The case also raised troubling ethical questions about informed consent and the exploitation of desperate workers. Many of Pemberton's participants had agreed to sustain genuine injuries because they were poor, desperate for money, and willing to risk their health for payment. While they'd consented to participate, their consent was obtained through economic coercion and manipulation. "This is what happens when medical knowledge is divorced from medical ethics," Holmes observed. Pemberton possessed extraordinary surgical skill, but used it to harm rather than heal, to deceive rather than enlighten, to exploit vulnerable people rather than protect them. He represents the darkest possibility of medicine: knowledge without compassion, skill without conscience. Years later, the case influenced major reforms in insurance claims processing. Medical documentation now requires multiple independent verifications before large claims are paid, specifically to prevent the kind of fraud Pemberton orchestrated. Insurance companies established databases to track claims and identify suspicious patterns, making it much harder to file multiple claims based on single injuries. The case remained one of my favorite investigations to recall. Not for its pleasant aspects, certainly, but because it demonstrated how impossible medical phenomena could be explained through careful reasoning about deception, rather than accepting supernatural or physically impossible explanations. When faced with medical impossibility, Holmes told me years later, the detective's first question should not be, "How is this possible?" but rather, "How is this being made to appear impossible?" The surgeon's impossible patient wasn't truly impossible. He was carefully constructed fraud, designed to exploit the assumption that documented medical treatment must reflect genuine injury. By questioning that assumption, by recognizing that wounds could be created rather than merely sustained, the impossibility dissolved into mundane criminal deception. The 2 bullets removed from Kearney, ultimately proven to be the same bullet through microscopic comparison of unique manufacturing marks, became exhibits in criminal trials and eventually were donated to Scotland Yard's Criminal Museum. They stand as testimony to the extraordinary lengths criminals will go to perpetrate fraud and the importance of skeptical investigation, even when medical documentation appears conclusive. Dr. Whitfield recovered from the professional crisis the case created, though he never fully trusted colleagues the same way afterward. He continued his distinguished surgical career, but instituted new verification procedures for patient identities and injury circumstances, refusing to accept patients' statements uncritically. The case taught me that medicine and detection share important principles. Both require careful observation, skeptical questioning of apparent facts, and willingness to consider deception as explanation for unusual phenomena. Just as physicians must consider that patients might misrepresent symptoms, detectives must consider that criminals might create false evidence designed to exploit professional expertise and institutional trust.